To our lunch and to our keynote lunch. Our keynote speaker is Cass R. Sunstein. I'd like to say a few words about Professor Sunstein before we bring him up. I'm really very pleased to introduce Cass Sunstein, he is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard University, and of course spent many years, we think 20 to 30 years at the University of Chicago Law School before that. I'm fairly sure that he is the most cited legal scholar in the country. I haven't actually added up all the numbers, but he's also probably the most prolific. I tried to count, and I could only get an approximation, but he has published more than 50 books and several hundred articles. Including, I'm very happy to say, at least 2 in the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis, which I highly recommend both articles to you. And I think probably everyone here is familiar with much of his work. We have to, of course, describe Nudge, written with Richard Thaler, and of course the subsequent articles and books on Nudge. This is something that has the term, the notion, has entered the vocabulary and the practice of regulatory design and evaluation. I mean, this is almost a subfield, so this is rather remarkable. But also, let me remind you of all the other work that Professor Sunstein has done for our field and in our field. The much work on the precautionary principle and the trade-offs between risk and benefits. Some of his book titles even give that away, like Risk and Reason, the cost-benefit state. I really love that title, by the way. I might call it the benefit-cost state, but you get the idea. Laws of fear beyond the precautionary principle. Value in life, harmonizing the regulatory state. One of my favorites, conspiracy theories and other dangerous ideas. And two very recent books, the Cost-Benefit Revolution and On Freedom. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's just so much work and so much influence that it's just, he is, for those of us in this field, he's just part of our working life, part of our intellectual baggage in a sense, or intellectual, maybe not baggage, but intellectual life. Although life may well be baggage. But also, in addition to this, from 2009 to 2012, he served as the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. And at the time, I was an economist at the Food and Drug Administration working on regulations. And as most of you who are in regulatory agencies know, OIRA is extraordinarily powerful. And we quail and tremble at OIRA reviews, and because they are the deciders. And the administrator is really powerful. It's probably as close as one comes to an omnipotent public official. So Cass Sunstein, in addition to his great scholarly and intellectual achievements and teaching, knows what real power feels like. I should add that in his book, Simpler, he claims there were limits on his power. I'm not convinced. He didn't quite convince me that there were, but I should throw in that disclaimer. So it's really with great pleasure that, and we're really thrilled to have him here, that I welcome Cass Sunstein, who's going to talk to us about sludge and ordeals. So, Professor Sunstein.
So many friends. It's nice to see people whom I've known for a long time, people with whom I've worked. people whose work I admire and who's defined this field. Hi Bridget. Hi Kip. I know you all, so I'm just going to say hi to you all for these remarks. So those are an incredibly kind introduction. What Clark omitted to say is there's a recent empirical study, it was published in, I think, the Yale Law Journal, that showed per word written, I'm the least cited law professor in America. Okay, let me start with a number, 9.78 billion. That's the number of hours in paperwork burdens that the US government imposes on the American people, according to the most recent report from the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which was a few years ago. Now, we're going to use that number, 9.78 billion, for purposes of these remarks, but I know from someone in this room that the actual number, which is a little trickier to find, it's public, but it's a little more hidden, is 11.3 billion. That's the current number of hours in paperwork burdens that the US government imposes on the American people. If we took every resident of Chicago, my old home, and insisted that for all of 2019, including January and February, as well as where we are now, and told each one, man, woman, and child, you have to spend 40 hours a week engaged in one task, filling out federal forms. Does this sound like real fascism? By the end of 2019, the 2.7 million citizens of Chicago won't have come within 4 billion hours of the annual paperwork burden placed on America. If we value an hour of work at $20, which is a little lower than what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says, about $27, if we value an average at 20, we're speaking of the equivalent of nearly $200 billion annually, which is more than double the budget of the State Department and the Department of Transportation, triple the budget of the Department of Education, and 8 times the budget of the Department of Energy. In terms of the toll taken by that $9.78 billion, that dollar figure understates the problem. If we're speaking about licenses and permits, about life-changing benefits or crushing hardship, administrative burdens make it impossible for people to enjoy them. The Earned Income Tax Credit is one example. That's one of the most effective and beneficial of anti-poverty programs. The Earned Income Tax Credit is not surrounded by a crushing paperwork burden. It's not terrible on that count, but the take-up rate is a lot south of 100%, and it could easily be closer to 100% if the administrative burden was lessened. So that's my number for you, 9.7 billion. I also have a story that comes from an insufficiently known but magnificent essay with a memorably precise name, Everyone Believes in Redemption. But it's not a theological paper. It's a paper about behavioral economics. What is noticed by the authors is that if you buy a product with a mail-in form, redemption rates typically range between 10% and 40%. And that's not crazy off the number for the take-up rate of a wide range of beneficial programs, between 10% and 40%. That suggests that redemption programs are smart when companies use them. Because of the immense power of inertia, the smallness of those numbers might not be shocking, but here's something more surprising. People are wildly over-optimistic about the likelihood that they will mail their forms. So we have a low take-up rate and a sense ex ante that the likelihood of mail-in is close to 100%. In one study, people thought it was not far below 100% likely that they would mail in a form within 30 days of when they were given it. The actual redemption rate in the relevant study was 31%. It's a field study, 31%. It's an overstatement to say that everyone believes in redemption, but almost everyone does. The researchers tried 3 efforts with different groups of people to reduce the difference between the predicted and actual redemption rates. And yes, all of them were nudges. The first one involved informing people very clearly that in previous groups with similar people, redemption rates were around 1/3. That should work. It should counteract unrealistic optimism, yes? People are told similarly situated people don't mail in their form. The second, people were given clear reminders soon after purchase and again when the deadline was redemption was rapidly approaching, you better mail in your form now. That ought to work. Redemptions are a terrifically successful nudge. The third was to make redemption easier by eliminating the requirement that people print out and sign a certification page. That's the third. Now, I confess that if I were asked which of the 3 of these would work, I would think with clarity, but not 100%, that the second would be the best. The reminders would work. That would be a terrible prediction. And I do this stuff. Still, terrible prediction. None of the 3 reduced people's optimism at all. All of the 3 kept them at that near 100% likelihood that they would redeem. Somewhat surprisingly, the first 2 interventions had no effect on what people actually did. So the reminder had no impact, and the previous groups aren't mailing in their forms have no impact. About the behavior of other groups, people apparently thought, well, those are other groups. What do they have to do with us? Reminders typically focus attention and reduce the power of inertia. In this case, useless. The only one that worked some was simplification. By making it easier to mail in forms and thus reduce paperwork burdens, the willingness to act rose dramatically to well over 50%, which means that the disparity between belief and behavior was cut dramatically. My topic is sludge, a term coined by my co-author Richard Thaler to refer to friction. What I'm going to be calling for is institutional sludge audits by governments, local, state, US, elsewhere, in which there's a systematic effort to audit practices that impose sludge. Audit followed by a form of cost-benefit analysis, which says if the benefits of sludge imposition can't be shown to exceed the costs, then the sludge has to be eliminated. And this is a plea to all governments, emphatically including the Trump administration, which to its credit is taking an aggressive stand against outmoded and unjustified regulations and trying to get rid of them. Nonetheless, under President Trump, the paperwork burden has risen from the not an applause line, 9.78 billion, to much worse, 11.3 billion. Does the president know that? Presidents typically don't focus on the numbers. There's no question no president is going to want on his watch an increase in the paperwork burdens on the American people of over 1 billion or a significant percent. So the plea is for a sludge audit with a deregulatory effort of unprecedented aggressiveness to cut that number with careful reference to cost-benefit analysis. From the public sector, sludge is sometimes an accident or a product of insufficient attentiveness to the magnitude of the burden. It might also be a political choice, but the consequences can be extremely severe and way undersold by the time suck that sludge imposes. Parents might want to sign up their children for a beneficial program, such as free transportation or free school meals, but the sludge might defeat them. As all of you, I'm sure, are aware, to obtain financial aid for college, students have to fill out the free application for federal student aid. The word free is both literally true and also cruelly ironic. The person who named it, if time has a price, the person who named it had a sense of humor. The form is long and complicated, and it requires young people, many of them, really struggling to make something at a crucial stage of their lives, to make something of themselves, to provide information they lack. Many students give up. The right to vote is arguably the most fundamental of all, but a sludge-pervaded registration process is going to disenfranchise millions of people. A sludge reduction initiative in this context would be our generation's Voting Rights Act. Millions of people are now benefiting from the Global Entry Program, which reduces time, trouble, and stress at security lines and airports. TSA Pre is its cousin. I just registered today for CLEAR, which is a sibling. For school meals, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has adopted the Direct Certification Program authorized by Congress, which means that parents don't have to enroll their children at all. If the school district knows that they're eligible, they're automatically enrolled. In recent years, the percentage of eligible kids who are getting those meals under the direct certification program, who are legally entitled to them, is over 90%. And the raw number is around in the vicinity of 10 million. And that's a statistic. But if the sludge reduction initiative produced, let's say, a representative sample of 20 of those kids outside this room after this talk, I wonder if there would be a dry eye in the House. A number of states have taken steps to simplify voter registration. In less than a year, Oregon's effort to this effect produced like that, 250,000 new voters, and about 100,000 of them actually voted. Public and private sectors can do a ton to reduce sludge, to help workers choosing among health care plans, to make it easier for consumers and employees with ideas and complaints, and to help people avoid serious life risks. Okay, this is going to pain me for a moment, so you'll see I'll be wincing while I'm going to do this, but we're going to do it. I was at the University of Chicago, so we're going to do it. Let's assume that people are fully rational. In deciding whether to navigate forms, they have to make a calculation about costs and benefits. Even for purely rational actors, in the face of potentially significant benefits with the appropriate discount rate, the relevant costs might prove overwhelming. It might just not be worth it. The cost might involve acquisition of information, which can be difficult and burdensome. The cost might involve time, which people might not be able to afford. Or more subtly, it might be psychological. It might involve frustration, stigma, and humiliation. Because of psychological costs, time costs, or information acquisition costs, rational people might conclude it's just not worth it to do the paperwork. That explains the low take-up rate for numerous federal and state programs, and why some of the sludge that consists of components of that 9.78 billion hours is so harmful. Now let's put a smile on our faces and refer to departures from perfect rationality. Lift the room up a little bit. Sorry. And emphasize that if people aren't fully rational, the magnitude of the impact of sludge will increase dramatically. If people tend to procrastinate and suffer from inertia, they might never do the necessary paperwork. That problem is compounded by present bias, which means that the future often seems like a foreign country, later land, and we're not sure we're ever going to visit. It's tempting to put off sludge burdens for another day, which may never come. The redemption study is narrow. It involves mail-in forms, but it has big implications. It helps explain why participation rates are often much lower with opt-in designs than with opt-out designs. Suppose in this light that under federal regulations, startups, small businesses, and individuals have to fill out forms to avoid penalties or to obtain significant benefits. They might intend to do exactly that, but if the task can be put off or is burdensome or difficult, their behavior might not match their intentions. The actual costs might turn out to be very high. The government might lowball their magnitude. The perceived costs might be far higher. I hope you can see now the glimpse of one of the culminations of my plea, which was for regulators to scrub existing paperwork burdens through a sludge audit. More generally, sludge has an impact that many people just don't foresee, including those in government and those who are subject to sludge. Even specialists are often surprised at the extent to which apparently promising programs fail. In addition, sludge can be used opportunistically by clever marketeers who seek to give consumers the impression they're getting a great deal, but who know the consumers aren't going to take advantage of the opportunity. Government officials, in my experience, don't usually try to use sludge opportunistically. They may be responding to political values and commitments, which are not the same thing. At the same time, they often fail to anticipate the adverse effects of sludge. Here's, I think, the prize winner of the most dramatic study in behavioral economics in the last 5 years. And it's not necessarily the best, though it's a candidate for that too. It's the most dramatic. It was done by Peter Bergman at Columbia and Todd Rogers at the Kennedy School, who studied if parents are going to enroll in programs by which they receive text message alerts about the academic progress of their children. It's a very effective program at increasing educational attainment. So it gets 3 check marks next to it in terms of the kind of program from which children can benefit. If parents are asked whether to sign up, the participation rate with a modest amount of sludge is, guess what? 1%. That's pathetic. You could imagine an equivalent of an OIRA or a behaviorally informed team saying, let's simplify the process. Let's change it so that they don't have to encounter as much sludge. Let's cut it dramatically. In that intervention, the effect was to increase participation to 8%. Now, if you were writing an annual report of what you did, an increase of 1% to 8% would probably make it into the report. That's worthwhile. That's a pretty big deal. But you wouldn't be that proud of the achievement, would you? 92% are unenrolled. The third intervention, or the second intervention, the third condition, was automatically to enroll parents with an easy opt-out. The participation rates under that condition were 96%. Almost everyone was involved. Now, what's remarkable about that is not only the 95% increase of opt-out versus opt-in, but also the fact that educational experts in the relevant districts were asked what they would think would be the difference between opt-in and opt-out, and they were nowhere in the universe of the actual difference. They massively lowballed the effect of sludge elimination. And data is coming in suggesting that doctors, lawyers, and business people typically are clueless about the massive effect of a shift through the elimination of sludge, which implies that the reduction of sludge also will have an unanticipatedly large impact on the people with whom they're working. Okay, one reason that the shift in sludge levels matters so much is that people's cognitive resources are limited. The best organizing theory we've had in the last couple of years for unifying behavioral findings refers to the limited character of human attention. If you're busy, poor, disabled, or elderly, the problem of cognitive scarcity is especially serious, which means that it's important to focus on the distributive effects of administrative burdens on the populations whom they're likely to hit hardest. There's a kind of macabre passage in a recent book on this topic involving a program designed to protect the elderly, and it's a very important program that involves a level of sludge, and there are a series of interviews. One of the recipients of benefits said, "This is the time in my life when people are asking me to fill out these forms?" And the plea by the person in his 80s, you can see it has humor in his own words, is, "I could have done this when I was 40. Now? No." Apart from cognitive issues, poor people often are beneficiaries of programs that are accompanied by sludge, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes because of an effort to limit the pool of beneficiaries. But if you're poor, you have to focus on a wide range of immediately pressing problems. If the government's asking poor people to navigate a complex system, they might give up. For different reasons, the problem of sex equality deserves particular attention because women do a disproportionate amount of administrative work, that kind of sludge that involves running the household, arranging meals, taking care of kids. A significant reduction in sludge could reduce a pervasive source in social inequality. Okay, I hope you're thinking now that sludge often has legitimate justifications, and that's completely true. So let me sketch now what I think are the three most prominent and then get to policy recommendations. The most important goes by the name of program integrity. Sludge is often rooted in a desire to ensure that programs work in the way that the law requires. One reason involves eligibility restrictions. Another involves record keeping. If the Internal Revenue Service decided to send the Earned Income Tax Credit to all apparently eligible taxpayers, no sludge at all, there would be no objection if the recipients were all legally deserving recipients. But it's predictable, isn't it, that some of the recipients would not be eligible under the program, that the IRS would make a mistake. And it needs to require sludge to reduce the likelihood of undeserving beneficiaries. Whenever people are automatically enrolled in a program, some of them won't meet the legal criteria. Okay, if we are welfareists, I think the first route into this dilemma is to notice that there's a choice between a design ensuring that some eligible people won't receive a benefit, that's the sludge-pervaded program, and a design ensuring that some ineligible people will receive a benefit. That's the sludge-eliminating program. If the idea of program integrity is meant to refer to the number of errors, the choice should turn on arithmetic. Which group is bigger? Yes? If you have more eligible people getting enrolled through automatic enrollment than you have ineligible people getting enrolled through automatic enrollment, you get what I'm saying? That's the assessment you do. Now, inside official quarters, some of where you now work, this arithmetic exercise is too simple because the grant of taxpayer money to people who are undeserving is a more grave problem on one view than the denial through sludge of resources to people who didn't apply. And that's a fair position. From a welfarist standpoint, it's not a correct position, but maybe we would want to weight the grant of money to ineligible people more than the denial through sludge of resources to people who are deserving. The question is then, what are the magnitude of the two sizes, and how do we assess the awfulness of either a denial or an undeserving grant? That is a fair point. It suggests program integrity is really important, and it will often justify a degree of sludge and count on the benefit side of the assessment, which I'm going to get to. Okay, second category, self-control problems. Not program integrity, self-control. Sludge can often be understood as a way of protecting people against their own recklessness and impulsivity. Behavioral Economists often distinguish between system 1, which is automatic and intuitive and rapid and sometimes emotional, and system 2, which is deliberative and reflective. You can think of sludge as an effort to strengthen the hand of system 2. I have a little boy, 9 years old, who loves toys. When we pass a toy store, he says, "Daddy, can we go in?" And this gets old. So after a while, I explained to him the difference between system 1 and system 2, as any father would, and told him, your system 1 wants toys, your system 2 knows you have plenty of toys and they're just going to take up space in your room. That's what's happening here. And he said, "Oh, got it." And for a few weeks, this really worked until he said to me, "Daddy, do I even have a system 2?" For mundane decisions, sludge is frequently imposed online. By the way, I wasn't quick enough to say what just occurs to me now, which is he wouldn't have asked that question if he didn't have a system 2. That was a good point that he had. He was showing he had a system 2. Okay, if you have questions online saying, "Are you sure you want to?" send an email that has the F word in it, activate a ticket, cancel a recent order, or delete a file. There are burdens, sludge, and that can be a blessing. Some forms of sludge are the equivalent of cooling off periods designed to ensure a period of deliberation. That's a fair point. It is possible, in light of the stakes of some decisions, to defend administrative burdens as a way of promoting reflection, reducing the role of behavioral biases, and providing essential information. Okay, the most intriguing of the justifications for sludge is the third and last on which I'm going to spend some time, which grows out of literature on hassles and ordeals, exploring how burdens and sludge can operate as rationing devices, ensuring that people get things who most want or need them. So a way to think about this is that an expenditure of time is a little like an expenditure of money, and the willingness to pay criterion has a younger cousin, let's say, called the willingness to pay time criterion, which is a measure of intensity of desire or need for a good. We could say that sludge is a screening device, ensuring that, as in markets, people are receiving goods who most intensely want them, and willingness to persevere or wade through sludge is a way of ensuring that we screen properly. The problem is that willingness to pay time discriminates against people who don't have a lot of that. And there may not be a whole lot of connection between willingness to pay time and desire or need for a good. Sludge is a singularly crude method of targeting. A complex, barely comprehensible form for receiving federal aid is not a reliable way to ensure that people who need financial aid actually get it. It's not as if it's a random screening device. It has some, correlation, willing to do the form and need for the good. But if the goal is to ensure that people who are eligible for X actually receive X, sludge is not the best sorting mechanism. Actually, it's worse than that. Data is increasingly showing that ordeals, the technical term for some forms of sludge, work in concert with the limitations faced by relevant populations, so as specifically to select out those with the highest needs. That's the problem. Now, what are we going to do about this? We have a sense of the pervasiveness of sludge, the problems introduced by sludge, and the plausible but sometimes inadequate justifications for sludge. Okay, I have a proposal for the amazing people where I was privileged to work at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is to go hard and soon at that 11.3 billion annual hours. So one of my, I'll say, regrets from my own opportunity to serve was that I came later than I should have to sludge reduction as a policy priority. The way to do this could be multiple. The most visible, of course, would be an executive order from the President of the United States, and I think the nation should welcome that, which is a sludge reduction executive order, which could have a degree of generality or a degree of precision. It could come from the director of OMB. It could be done informally through a data call. If we keep that 11.3 billion hour figure in mind, let's go with that one, we could imagine a directive from OIRA soon announcing an initiative to require in the next short period, let's say, a reduction of existing burdens by at least some specified number, let's say 2 million hours, by the agencies that currently impose the greatest burdens. A focus on reducing burdens imposed on vulnerable subpopulations, including, let's say, the elderly, the disabled, and veterans. An effort to require agencies that do not impose the highest levels of burdens to come up with 3 initiatives that would reduce burdens by 200,000 hours. A focus, too, on reducing burdens in areas where those burdens compromise policy goals of special interest to the current administration. Now, those will overlap with some of the prior administration, diverge in other ways. That's its right to reduce burdens where it deems them most troublesome from policy authorities. OIRA has no direct authority over state and local governments, but OIRA could use its convening power with respect to them to try to prioritize the many damaging efforts by state and local governments in areas that range from benefit provision to occupational licensing to development permits to try to reduce burdens. That is not a usual thing for OIRA to do. It would be an excellent thing for OIRA to do. Let's talk about Congress now, shall we? Regulatory reform bills in Congress take 1,000 different forms. So far as I'm aware, there isn't one of those 1,000 different forms that has any of these simple notions in them, which shouldn't raise ideological hackles. Number one, Congress should require a periodic look back at existing paperwork burdens to see if the existing stock can be justified and to eliminate those that seem pointless or too costly. The look-back requirement could be imposed as part of the annual report, the paperwork, the information collection budget of the United States, where there's a public document saying what's been done. Second, Congress should explicitly require agencies to choose the least burdensome method for achieving their goals. Whether this is judicially enforceable or not is a fair question, but a requirement of cost effectiveness could empower OIRA and the forces, let's say, for goodness within the agencies in the best way by saying if you can do as much through quarterly reporting, as much through annual reporting as through quarterly reporting, then you have to do annual reporting. And these things may seem small, but in terms of the aggregate hours, and in some cases the magnitude of effects on the underlying policy goal are really high. Most relevant to the present moment, Congress should require, for the first time in this, or to my knowledge, any nation's history, require the benefits of paperwork requirements to justify the costs. It's not crazy to read the Paperwork Reduction Act in its current form to do that, but it takes fancy footwork. It's not easy. Congress should give an explicit signal to this effect. It's true that quantification of the benefits of paperwork impositions in terms of program integrity or strengthening of System 2 or of protecting privacy or other interests are often challenging to quantify. But that's a second, for purposes of these remarks and the initiative, that's a second or third order consideration. We have tools by which to handle hard to quantify variables, and they are clearly usable in this context, if only to engage in something like break-even analysis. One thing we need is a lot more information about the actual benefits of collecting information. A requirement of cost-benefit analysis of balancing would help. It would also spur, in a hurry, more creative ways to test whether the benefits of current requirements justify the costs. Private and public institutions armed with mandates of this sort would be required to engage in sludge audits. Covering the entire federal government, the information collection budget is kind of a sludge audit, but it's awfully crude. To require the FDA or the EPA or the Department of Transportation to do a sludge audit every year would be a step in the right direction. Okay, time to conclude. What is necessary is a heavily empirical approach to administrative burdens, focusing first and foremost on the magnitude of the benefits and the magnitude of the costs. By the way, no one who's worked at OIRA, I think, would be stunned to hear that the actual number of paperwork hours is higher than 9.7 billion. The projected hour is maybe optimistic. And to focus also on distributive effects. This empirical assessment requires answers to really important questions where we don't have answers. Are they really helping to reduce fraud? By how much? What are the take-up rates under existing programs, and how do they vary across subgroups? What are the compliance costs in terms of time and money? The answers to those questions won't always be self-evident, and in some cases we're going to have a valuation problem. If sludge discourages the exercise of the abortion right, reasonable people are going to disagree about whether that's a benefit or a cost. That's fair. To know whether sludge causes losses or gains, in some cases we're going to run into intense disagreements about values. But in most cases, and this is why this is an opportunity, value disagreements are really boring. In most of these cases, they're boring. Acquisition of relevant information is just going to demonstrate across competing values that the sludge isn't worth the candle. For the future, it should be a high priority, and I mean tomorrow, for deregulation and deregulators. It should be a high priority to reduce sludge because its benefits cannot possibly justify its costs. I have one kind of larger query here, and I'm going to tell you it by way of last sentences. What's the most precious commodity that human beings have? Time. Time is the most precious commodity that those of us who are blessed to have some, that's what we've got. Let's see if we can find ways to give our fellow citizens more of it. Thanks. A number of you I've seen, you want the room to be warmer. We're going to turn up the heat.
Yes, we are, I want to make a general, we are sorry about the room. Everybody's aware of it, but apparently nobody knows how to turn down the heat. We're not getting any help from outside.
No, the data suggests that in a room that's a little warmer than comfortable, people are happier and smarter than normal. It's actually not true, but let's indulge the assumption.
I'm Jack Wells, formerly of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Cass, would you agree that one of the reasons for the persistence of sludge is that sludge is profitable for certain sectors of the economy? And I'm thinking particularly of the Internal Revenue Service, which is probably the major producer of sludge requirements, and it's been widely known for at least the last 10 years that IRS could auto-populate your income tax return based on income data that's already been submitted to you, send it out to you by email, let you fill it out online, and send it in by email without involving TurboTax or accountants or other tax preparers. But of course, there is an industry that relies on the significance of sludge and that profits from filling out all those forms for you and sending them in.
It's completely right. So I have all the admiration in the world for former colleagues in the IRS who, they have tough jobs, and many of them have worked very hard and to some extent successfully in sludge reduction. But the idea you have, which is worth engaging, it has some questions, which is to make tax returns more automatic. You're completely right that interest groups have said you're going to put us out of business, and they've succeeded in stopping what would be a valuable conversation. So there are people who benefit from sludge imposition as such because that's their job. And there are also people, the private sector is the simplest to describe, who make dollars because of sludge. So to subscribe to magazines is really easy. To stop subscribing to magazines is hard. You can't.
You gotta cancel the credit card and then it works.
Hi, Cass. Adam Finkel, formerly of OSHA. Just an observation, I think you remember, as I do, Vice President Gore tried a lot of this in the 95, 6, 7, 8, 9 period. My kind of vague recollection of being there at the time was that we tried hard, but it was hard to find programs, paperwork burdens that were clearly reducible, that clearly didn't have benefits, and that the people who were burdened by clearly wanted to engage in a conversation with us about specific one. There was a lot of inchoate criticism of the whole burden, but to get down to which ones we had to get rid of by some percent, I forget what it was. And the other comment I just want to make was, I assume you would draw a fairly hard line between forms and paperwork versus research. In other words, information collection that is explicitly data collection and not just program integrity, but the actual statistics and things that keep the government and the country functioning.
Okay, so that's great. So one reason for sludge is research purposes, and that certainly requires engagement. What I wonder is whether it isn't valuable to say research like mortality reduction. This isn't your favorite analogy I'm giving, I know, but it doesn't have infinite value. So both have less than infinite value. So the researchers would need to demonstrate in a way that's credible that the sludge is not more than X and that the research benefit is not less than Y, and there's a conversation to be had. But I take your point completely. It's a very important point about data collection. On the Gore example, I'll tell you, I was at the University of Chicago, as stated, for a long time, and there was an old guy there, great guy in the literature department, the English literature department. In response to any new idea, he'd say either, "We did that," or "We never did that." And that exhausted the possibilities. So OIRA has at times, post-Gore, had the experience of succeeding in cutting paperwork burdens significantly. Not in a way that would make that 9.78 billion look like 7 billion, but we're talking hundreds of millions. And I was involved in an initiative which involved the Department of Transportation and the Internal Revenue Service as kind of prize winners. And they did a lot, not as much as they should, but a lot. One example was the Department of Transportation required truck drivers to inspect their cars and fill out a form at the end of the day, and then the next morning too. They hadn't done anything in between. And on reflection, wasn't a good idea. And I had a conversation actually with someone in this room, I won't out him, who said that during the deregulatory initiatives under President Obama and President Trump, this was kind of a cross-administration exercise, there was considerable success at eliminating costly administrative burdens that were just outmoded because they were based on technologies like faxes that were. Does any of you remember? I barely remember what is fax. I read about it in a history book that they don't work anymore. So the likelihood that a very determined effort in 2019 by the Trump administration, or a very determined effort by the state of New York, and I know DC is engaged in this. It has a form reduction project, which is extremely exciting, where they get I was participating in one of these, they get ordinary people in to try to fill out forms and see how hard it is. And then they ask them, what would make it easier for you? And they learn things. And what I like about this is that something where the likelihood of ideological disagreement across a wide terrain is zero. There's a terrain where you're going to get one, but we don't have to worry about that. Make progress without getting there.
It's over here. Richard Belzer, OIRA 88 to 98, and I haven't forgotten. OIRA reviews about 5,000 ICRs a year, at least alleges to, and it disapproves a handful. It has the authority to make sure that practical utility exceeds the burden, which you're alluding to as something that could be done. Maybe you could amend the information collection rule, for example. But could you be more explicit about ways that OIRA might be, shall we say, nudged to disapprove more of these ICRs? Because after all, if they were all worth doing, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Okay, so I have, to say I have admiration for people at OIRA is to understate it. I mean, the quality and commitment of people at OIRA is on a scale of 1 to 10, 11 under every administration. So the two questions that I think it would be fair for a Republican or Democratic OIRA leadership to ask is, what can we do about the existing stock, and what can we do about the flow? And about the stock, which is the 9.78 billion. Now, things come up for renewal, so there's that. But about the stock, an aggressive effort by the president or by the chief of staff or by the OMB director or by OIRA in this next year that would do something like a ramped up version. This is the most modest. It's qualitatively the same but quantitatively different, a ramped up version of what comes in the data call. Do it electronic rather than paper, do it less frequently, use automaticity, use pre-population of forms. A ramped up version of that for the stock could produce significant benefits. And if we can't get 9.78 billion hours down to 7 billion, if we can get 9.78 down to 9.2, or if we can get 11.3 down to 9.78, where it was last time it was formally calculated in information collection, that's great. So some political leaders I know have a phrase which in this context is relevant. It's better is good. We have a very daunting problem. To have small steps often seems pitiful, but better is good. So that's about the stock. In terms of the flow, I wouldn't want to criticize anyone who's been there, recently or who's there now, but it would be very possible, just to give a clear signal, we're not going to be approving these things unless they're very powerfully justified. And the likelihood that one that is very burdensome is going to be approved is lower today than it was yesterday. And to see what kind of effect that would have. Now, OIRA is, just part of a very large operation, and to deal with respectfully with people at OSHA or the FDA or DOT is essential. They will be the area specialists. But sometimes, I'm sure you observe this, people in the agencies will have a program priority, and they might be a little more legalistic than would be ideal. And I say this against interest because I'm a lawyer. The lawyers are often ramping up paperwork requirements, partly to avoid litigation risk. And to have engagement on that is something in terms of the flow that would be very good. You could imagine an executive order from the president. It would be unprecedented, but it would have the general music of President Trump's 1 in, 2 out rule. And something like that, I'm not sure it's a good idea, but it's among the set of candidates for cutting that, seeing that 9.78 as an urgent problem rather than a number.
So I like this a lot, but just maybe this is a technical point, but it might matter. So you talked about the uptake problem with a lot of programs that we want people, that we think that it is good for people to participate in. And then you said that the standard should be some kind of benefit cost analysis. But a lot of those programs are transfers. So that even if social science tells us that they make people better off in terms of long-term health or educational attainment or something else, an orthodox benefit cost analysis would see that as a zero benefit. So is there a way that you can recommend some other quantification that would allow for that to be defined or recognized as a benefit?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I think a deep answer, which I'm not equipped to give, would suggest that in the fullness of time, we should be able to do something more like benefit cost analysis of transfer programs than we now do, and to have some sense of the welfare gain produced by a transfer program compared to the welfare loss. And I wonder if OIRA in an annual cost benefit report couldn't signal that, or occasionally in the context of a transfer program couldn't say something about that, if only as part of a gesture toward the existence of an issue. The more responsible and less speculative answer is, if you can't do benefit cost analysis because it's a transfer program, at least you can see what is the magnitude of the transfer program's gain compared to the cost imposed on the relevant population. So if a program which has a lot of sludge, let's say, has a de minimis effect on the benefited population, then all of the cost is the hours, and we can start with 27 and multiply it times, and it might look like a clear winner or a clear loser. On the other hand, if you have hundreds of thousands of people not having access to a program because it's sludge level X, and if you reduce sludge to sludge level Y, they're all in, then there would have to be something really wonderful about the sludge. Sludge must be accomplishing something really good, and then the agency would have to explain that.
Professor Sunstein, I'm wondering if you could...
Paul Peretz, the Claremont Graduate University. When I was at Chicago, we were taught to look at the supply side as well as the demand side. Most of yours is entirely on the demand side. Your school teacher would have had a lot more people wanting to see her, to talk about their students. Her workload would expand enormously, and she wouldn't be paid any more for it. Typically, it is a she. And the same is true in almost all the other places. The people you're asking to do something are the people on the supply side, and almost always it would expand their workload, and they wouldn't necessarily get anything out of it that's good, and they would get things out of it that are bad. And so shouldn't you look at both sides?
Do you think the people at the Department of Agriculture are sad today because they don't pass on applications to be in the school lunch program? Are they thinking, oh my gosh, we don't pass on those applications, it's automatic? Do you think at let's say, X university or small company Y, the fact that employees are automatically enrolled in a savings program on the supply side is a source of...
There are examples where there aren't these costs, but most of the things you were talking about, there would have been these costs.
Well, I wonder. So suppose there's a occupational licensing program which makes it so that to be a landscape architect in state X or to cut hair in state Y, you have to navigate sludge. Suppose there's a simplification effort, then the people who work for the bureaucracy, they also have more time. Now, if to them the meaning of life is determined by passing on applications, I'm being a little ridiculous here, apologies. So what I'm wondering with the examples is, what are the examples where on the supply side I agree with you that if there's a adverse effect on supply side, which would be bureaucratic time or taxpayer resources, that would be a problem. So maybe a good one for you would be if we switch to sludge reduction, then a lot of people aren't going to be getting benefits who deserve them, and the taxpayers are hit. That completely is fair, and that would be a benefit for sludge. Another one, it's not on the supply side, it's on the demand side, is privacy, where it may be that sludge is a way of ensuring that the government doesn't go at your information unless you've actually provided it. So I'm sure you're right, and so I think probably the responsible answer is to say you're right, and that would have to be included in the overall analysis.
Hi, Professor Sunstein. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the difference between administrative burden on firms versus administrative burden on households.
Well, as a first approximation, I have a blockheaded answer, which is why I started with first approximation. My system one knew, use those words before you give the blockheaded answer, which is an hour is an hour. So if you have, and companies are in this respect uncontroversially people, so if there's, in this respect at least, so if you have a little company or a big company in San Francisco that's spending 200 hours trying to get a permit to do something, that's 200 hours. And if you have a household spending 200 hours, that's 200 hours. Now, maybe for distributive reasons, the one category of hours is more troubling. Maybe that one is just a cost of doing business and easily absorbed or something, and the other is very destructive.
Okay, I'm going to regret challenging you on this probably, but I'll do it anyways. Is that my system one, I guess? I mean, first of all, I think that there's, like in a political context, at least my own experience in Canada is that the constituency that would be arguing to reduce administrative burden on firms is far more well-financed and organized than the constituency that would want to argue for the reduction of administrative burden on households. And I'm not sure that we could necessarily say, I know my brother the lawyer tells me that a corporation is legally an individual, but I'm not sure that an hour of time for an individual in a firm is exactly the same as an hour of time for an individual in a household. So maybe could you expand a bit on your thoughts?
So you're clearly right that the deregulatory energy. Sorry, that was great. So that the deregulatory energy comes from those. The visible deregulatory energy comes from those who are best organized. Deregulators, the ones I know in Republican and Democratic administrations, are concerned with eliminating regulatory burdens, even if the demand for reducing those burdens isn't visible. So if you have a burden on a population, let's say, of people who are poorly organized but really struggling, that's not a weaker case for deregulation. And for paperwork too, that should be the same, but you're right, of course, on the politics. What I'm thinking on the corporations point is if the claim is, okay, so I know there are panels earlier and there's some very interesting work being done on distribution and cost-benefit analysis. I tend to think that there's so much progress to be made in ensuring that the benefits justify the costs, and that typically doing that will be either neutral or good on distributive grounds, that's the, the number one priority of policy reform. But it is fair and important to say that in cases where the people who are bearing the cost are suffering especially, that is a higher priority, I think, on utilitarian grounds, but also on flat distributive grounds than others. So I'm with you there. What I'm wondering is whether the household companies distinction is fine-grained enough for the distributive concern. You can have struggling little companies consisting of poor entrepreneurs who are trying to get their shop started, and you can have households that are doing great, except they have too much paperwork. And hooray for their efforts for paperwork reduction, but on distributive grounds, not the top priority.
We could keep this here all day, but we should. One more. We have time for one more question, and then.
Thank you.
Ken Axe, Cost Benefit Group. What about using Adam Smith's division of labor, hiring people to fill out the forms and maybe incentivizing them to automate themselves out of existence, basing their pay on how much they can automate?
It's a great idea. So with apps and with inventive companies, sludge is frequently lower than it would otherwise be, and automation often goes in that direction. That's good. To have that paralleled by a process by which the requirements are reduced, as well as the private adaptation to its existence is reduced. So you're making a great point, and I'm thinking if government, it's a little more creative than my idea of whether there's room for the FDA, say, working with the private sector, or at least encouraging the private sector. If you go on data.gov, I'm pretty confident that some of the apps that grow out of the initiative are sludge reduction apps, very much of the sort you're describing.